And I think that the problem we have in the AIDS world, and we need to be very honest about this, we predicted a much worse epidemic than has in fact occurred. And that outside southern and eastern Africa, HIV/AIDS has not become the pandemic that many people talked about. Now, obviously, all of us in this room are thrilled that that is the case. Nobody wants, in this part of the world, to see the sorts of figures that we would see in Lesotho or Mozambique. But it is important to recognise that this means it is not surprising that many political leaders do not see HIV as important in the way that we see it as important, and that other issues demand legitimate attention. And I want to say a word of warning, and I hope you will take it as coming from someone who has been in this movement for a very long time. I think we risk sounding very self-centred and very selfish to those people who are concerned with other issues of global inequality and development. And we desperately need to find ways of talking with them and of showing the connections between HIV/AIDS and things like climate change, food and water security, the collapse of effective states in many parts of the world. If we don't do that, we risk being isolated and being seen as a marginal and increasingly selfish lobby group. I want to make a couple of comments about how this relates to prevention, because I think it is that even if the best hopes of the biomedical researchers about treatment as prevention are true, I do not believe the resources will be available to implement them. And if that is the case, we cannot afford anything that lets us abandon peer education, community empowerment, mobilisation of affected populations, and the sort of work that so many of you in this room do, which is to try and improve and build communities among people who are marginalised and stigmatised. My great fear is that in the current mood that is being pushed by some people, particularly in the health sector, who are saying prevention is now primarily a biomedical issue, is we will lose the real political strength that comes from seeing prevention as something that requires mobilisation, empowerment and participation. Because we know essentially how to stop the transmission of HIV. We also know, particularly in the countries of Asia and the Pacific, all of us in this room know that the barriers are essentially imposed by cultural, religious and political leaders who refuse the clear evidence that is there about how the virus spreads and how we can control the spread of the virus. We know that in many parts of this region, governments are not willing to name the most vulnerable and affected behaviours. We know that in many of our countries, there are still people in government who say, but this sort of behaviour does not happen in my country. I have been in cities in Asia where I've heard government officials tell me, we do not have MSMs, we do not have sex workers. And then I walk down the street and I can find the MSM and the sex workers within 20 minutes. What sort of government officials do we have who are unable to see that? But of course they do see it. What government officials do we have who are so hypocritical that they would rather their own people die than they are willing to deal with the religious and cultural and traditional barriers to honesty? So the real challenges for us, I think, are to link our issues, our concerns, to broader questions about social justice, about global governance, and about the real issues that confront us as a global society in a period where technological, political, social and economic changes are happening extremely rapidly. And as I said, if we fail to do this, if we continue mainly to talk to ourselves, which is, I'm afraid, what we do, we will, I think, become less and less relevant in the larger political picture. And so I want to end up by posing some tough questions. And before I put them up, can I make clear, I don't have strong answers for these, and I'm being deliberately provocative. I think it is the role of a plenary speaker, and the chairs know me well enough to know that I like being provocative. So I have 4 questions that I would like us to all go away and think about and debate, and maybe these could be questions to be taken up in various sessions in Bangkok. I think we need to ask what is now the purpose of UNAIDS in a very different world to the one in which it was created. And in particular, how does UNAIDS and the Global Fund interconnect? And we need to be honest, and we cannot expect those institutions to answer that. It is us as their constituency who need to ask the hard question. Secondly, I think we have to ask some hard questions about the desire to invent something called prevention science. I get very nervous when I hear this term, prevention science, because it often means, as I said before, a limiting of community engagement and empowerment, and essentially is saying, hand it all over to the experts, they will look after it. And if for no other reason than the lack of resources, quite apart from the human rights and the political mobilisation arguments, I think that is dangerous. I think we have to ask hard questions about the role of private funders. I have never seen in an AIDS conference an analysis of the influence of the Gates Foundation on national policies. And yet in many parts of the world, the Gates Foundation is much more important than most donors, government donors. And if we're going to talk about accountability, then they too, and the various private foundations and the various organisations that support HIV work, need also to be scrutinised. And most importantly, and I say this deliberately as a member of the Governing Council of the International AIDS Society, we have to scrutinise our own organisations. We now have a generation of organisations that are coming up to their 25th year. We're grown up. It's time for us to think very carefully about where those organisations should go. Have some of them outlive their purposes? Is it still necessary? Is it still the best way to mobilise, to discuss, to network, to have this constant round of international conferences that involve huge amount of time and energy and resources, where ironically I am standing speaking to you in exactly the same way I would have done 25 years ago, and where the technology isn't even working. Now, as I say, I have no firm answers to any of those questions, but I think if we show that as a community of activists, officials, on-the-ground workers, clinicians, researchers, etc., we are willing to engage in self-reflection, we will find that we are much more powerful when we talk to governments and international organisations, because if we are not willing to ask those hard questions, they will ask them of us. And it is far better that we control that agenda, and that we set the agenda, and that we stay ahead and recognise the need to adjust to the very rapid changes going on in the global environment.